I think if you look over the last 6 months, there's been a lot of development in Southeast Asia, especially with the rhetoric and the movement away from coal. And in particular, if you look at the financing, we've been highlighting that in the research that it's becoming a lot more difficult to finance and build new coal-fired power plants. And that's really beginning to flow into the government policies as well. If you look at some of the power development plans that has been released by Thailand, for instance, they have started to move away from coal. Similarly, when you look at Indonesia, I do think there is a stronger rhetoric to reduce the number of coal-fired power plants that will be built, especially on Java Island. So the question is, what will fill this gap? And we've definitely seen a big push towards renewables. For example, in Thailand, they've just released their ambitious plans to develop 2.7 gigawatts of offshore solar floating platforms on their reservoirs. Similarly, in Vietnam and in Malaysia, you've seen a huge push to develop more solar projects. So I definitely think that all economies in Southeast Asia is moving towards a more green path, a more sustainable path in order to, I would say, pursue a low carbon pathway. So these, I would say, are some of the developments that we've seen over the last 6 months in particular. I think gas definitely is continuing to be relevant and it will play a part in Southeast Asia. And the reason is just the fundamentals around renewable energy development. While there is a lot of interest to push more utility scale solar, larger scale wind farms, they will still be insufficient to meet the growing requirements and the energy needs of the economy, especially for stable baseload power. Thermal generation, unfortunately, today can't be completely replaced by renewables. And that's very true. If you look at example of Vietnam, for instance, it's growing at about 10% on average. And even though there are ambitious plans to add in new solar capacity, when you start to look in that period, after 2025, there wouldn't be sufficient capacity that can displace all the coal-fired power plants as well as to meet the energy requirements. So gas would still continue to play a role. But of course, the problem is really that gas historically has been very cheap. If you look at a lot of the associated gas fields, they've been sold at prices like $2 to $3 per MMBTU. Unfortunately, the development cost today is much higher. It's at 7 to 8. And if you look at the LNG imports, it is continuing to grow. So the question for the industry and for players looking to invest in Southeast Asia is how do we ensure that higher priced gas can still play a role to meet the energy needs and still maintain affordability in the system. Well, there are many different investment opportunities across all the commodity classes in Southeast Asia. One example is if you look at the integrated gas to power project in Indonesia, the Java 1 project, we see that concept being expanded in Myanmar, being explored in the Philippines, and possibly even in Vietnam as well. Now, moving on from natural gas, if we look at the solar developments, there's been a lot of development in Vietnam with the introduction of the feed-in tariffs, in Malaysia because of the large-scale solar tenders, and finally, even in Thailand, when they have just recently announced their plans for installing 2.7 gigawatts of offshore solar floating platforms on their reservoirs. So you can see both markets has significant opportunities. But the question is really about affordability, and affordability must continue to be maintained when we are looking at these investment opportunities. A large part of that is really because of the electricity prices. And electricity prices in Southeast Asia are quite low. I am quite heartened when we look across the economies, there is a general trend of raising electricity prices. Vietnam, for instance, has just increased their power tariffs by 8%, and that brings up electricity to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. At this level, it's making it a lot more attractive for investors, and I do think that the opportunities in Southeast Asia, as prices continues to increase, would result in more development opportunities for foreign participants as well as for local players as well.